Picture this. You're standing in the marble halls of Nero's palace in 67 AD, watching as the emperor presents his new bride to the Roman court. A delicate figure draped in silk and jewels, moving with the practiced grace of imperial nobility. But as whispers ripple through the crowd, a horrifying truth becomes clear. The woman standing beside the most powerful man on earth was born a boy named Sporus, and what Nero did to transform him represents one of the most calculated acts of psychological destruction in human history. The emperor didn't just dress this teenager in women's clothing. He surgically mutilated his body, systematically erased his identity, and forced him to live as the reincarnation of a wife he had murdered in a fit of rage. Before we dive into this forgotten story of imperial madness and human suffering, if you're fascinated by the dark truths hidden in history's shadows, consider hitting that subscribe button and ringing the notification bell. Your support helps me bring these untold stories to light, and I'd love to hear in the comments where you re-watching from. It's incredible how we can explore these ancient tragedies together across time and continents, united by our need to understand the depths of human experience. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of Roman excess or imperial cruelty. This is the story of how obsessive love becomes indistinguishable from torture, how absolute power transforms grief into systematic abuse, and how one teenager, as resemblance to a dead woman, sealed his fate as a living monument to madness. The name Sporus might be unfamiliar, but his suffering will haunt you long after this story ends. Let's begin with the man who would orchestrate this nightmare. Emperor Nero, who started his reign as Rome's golden boy. When he ascended to the throne at just 16, Romans celebrated what they believed would be a return to prosperity and artistic achievement. The young emperor reduced taxes, funded magnificent public entertainments, and even performed in theatrical productions that delighted the common people. His early years showed genuine promise, suggesting that Rome had found a ruler who combined youthful energy with administrative wisdom. But absolute power corrupts in ways that are both predictable and terrifying. By 64 AD, something fundamental had twisted inside Nero's mind. Perhaps it was the constant paranoia that comes from knowing everyone around you desires your position. Maybe it was the isolation of being the only person in an empire of 60 million who could never be contradicted, never be challenged, never be told he was wrong. Or perhaps it was what happened to the woman he claimed to love more than life itself, a love that would ultimately destroy them both. Her name was Poppaea Sabina, and she embodied everything Nero thought he wanted in a partner. Ancient sources describe her as breathtakingly beautiful, with the kind of refined features that artists spent lifetimes trying to capture in marble. But Poppaea was far more than just a pretty face in the imperial court. She possessed razor-sharp political instincts that made her either a formidable ally or a dangerous enemy, depending on where you stood in the complex web of Roman power politics. When Nero first encountered Poppaea, he was already married to Octavia, daughter of the previous emperor, a cold, political arrangement that had never brought either spouse happiness. Poppaea represented everything that Octavia was not. Where Octavia was quiet and withdrawn, Poppaea commanded attention with her vivacious personality. Where Octavia sought to remain invisible at court functions, Poppaea reveled in being the center of everyone's gaze. The contrast was intoxicating to an emperor who had grown bored with his dutiful but passionless wife. The affair that began between Nero and Poppaea started as typical Roman scandal. Powerful men taking mistresses was hardly unusual in imperial circles, but what developed between them quickly evolved, beyond adultery, into something far more dangerous and consuming. Nero wasn't simply attracted to Poppaea's beauty or political acumen. He became obsessed with her in ways that terrified even his closest advisors, who had grown accustomed to their emperor's eccentric behavior. Ancient historians describe Nero's conduct during this period as increasingly erratic and possessive. He would fly into murderous rages if other men looked at Poppaea too long during public ceremonies. He stationed guards around her constantly, ostensibly for protection, but really to monitor her every conversation and interaction. The gifts he lavished upon her: jewels from India, silks from China, Perfumes from Arabia bankrupted the imperial treasury. But Nero seemed incapable of moderation when it came to demonstrating his devotion. Most tellingly, he began reshaping reality itself to accommodate his obsession. First came the shocking decision to divorce Octavia, a move that alienated many traditional supporters who valued stability in imperial marriages. Then he announced his intention to marry Poppaea in a full ceremonial wedding that would rival the grandest celebrations in Roman history. The ceremony itself was a spectacle of unprecedented luxury, with Nero sparing no expense to demonstrate that his love transcended ordinary political considerations. But even marriage couldn't satisfy Nero's need to possess Poppaea completely. He began isolating her from family and friends, surrounding her with people who owed their positions entirely to imperial favor. He commissioned dozens of portraits and sculptures depicting her, not just for public display, but for his private chambers, so he could gaze upon her image even during brief separations. Ancient sources tell us that Nero would sometimes spend hours simply watching Poppaea go about her daily activities, treating her less like a wife than like a beautiful object that existed solely for his pleasure. Poppaea, for her part, understood the dangerous game she was playing. She was intelligent enough to recognize that her beauty and Nero's obsession gave her unprecedented influence, but shrewd enough to realize this power came with enormous risks. She began using her position to advance her family's interests and build networks of supporters who might protect her if the emperor's affections ever wavered. But Poppaea possessed one characteristic that would prove fatal. She refused to be intimidated by Nero's power. Unlike everyone else in the imperial court who had learned to anticipate the emperor's moods and avoid provoking his anger, Poppaea retained her independence of spirit. She would argue with him about policy decisions, criticize his artistic pursuits when she found them lacking, and even mocked his theatrical performances when she thought they fell short of his ambitions. This fearlessness, which had initially attracted Nero, gradually became a source of tension as his mental state deteriorated. The details of what happened on that fatal day in 65 AD vary depending on which ancient source you consult, but the outcome remained tragically consistent during what began as a typical domestic argument. Some historians say about Nero returning late from chariot races, others about his theatrical commitments. The emperor lost control in a way that would haunt him for the rest of his life. According to Tacitus, the argument escalated when Poppaea dared to criticize Nero's priorities, suggesting he cared more about public adulation than his responsibilities as a husband and father. She was pregnant at the time, carrying what would have been their second child, and perhaps the physical discomfort and emotional stress made her less willing to tolerate Nero's increasingly erratic behavior. What happened next has been debated by historians for 2,000 years, but the scholarly consensus suggests that Nero, in an explosion of rage, struck or kicked his pregnant wife with such brutal force that she suffered fatal internal injuries. Some sources describe a single devastating blow to her abdomen. Others suggest a sustained attack that left her bleeding and unconscious on the marble floor of their private chambers. Imagine the moment when Nero's fury cleared and he realized what he had done. The man who commanded 30 legions, who could order executions with a gesture, who was worshipped as a living god in the eastern provinces, had just destroyed the one thing he genuinely cared about. The woman he had obsessed over, the person whose approval meant more than the adoration of millions, was dying because of his own uncontrolled violence. Ancient sources describe the scene that followed as one of the most pathetic in imperial history. Nero reportedly threw himself upon Poppaea's broken body, alternately begging for her forgiveness and commanding her to live, as if his imperial authority extended even over death itself. He summoned the finest physicians in Rome, offering them vast fortunes to save her life, while simultaneously threatening them with torture if they failed. But no amount of imperial power could undo what his rage had accomplished. Poppaea died within hours, taking with her the unborn child who might have secured Nero's dynasty. In that moment, something fundamental shattered inside the emperor's mind. The grief that consumed him was unordinary mourning. It was a complete break with reality that would have consequences extending far beyond his personal suffering. Nero's response to Poppaea's death became legendary for its extravagance and disturbing intensity. He refused to have her body cremated according to Roman custom, instead ordering it embalmed and placed in a tomb more elaborate than those of previous emperors. He declared her divine, established an official cult in her honor, and spent days talking to her corpse as if she could still hear and respond to his words. The imperial court now had to navigate an even more treacherous landscape than before. Courtiers were expected to participate in the fiction that Poppaea somehow remained alive, referring to her in present tense and leaving her favorite seat empty at state banquets. Anyone who suggested the emperor should accept reality and move forward with his life faced immediate exile or worse. The palace became a theater of collective madness, with hundreds of people pretending to interact with a dead woman to appease their unhinged ruler. It was during this period of imperial insanity that Sporus first attracted Nero's attention. Though the young man had no way of knowing, he was walking into a nightmare that would consume the rest of his brief life. Sporus was approximately 14 or 15 years old, born into slavery within the imperial household, but freed as a child, a status that represented relative privilege in Roman society. Freedmen in imperial service often enjoyed better living conditions than freeborn citizens of lower social classes, receiving education and opportunities that would have been impossible in their original circumstances. But this privilege came with a terrible price: complete dependence on imperial favor. Freedmen owed everything to their former master's generosity, creating a vulnerability that could be exploited without legal recourse. They might be elevated to positions of great influence, but they could just as easily be discarded, punished, or killed according to their patron's whims. What made Sporus special in Nero's deranged perception wasn't his intelligence, education, or administrative skills. It was his face. Multiple ancient sources agree that the young man bore an uncanny resemblance to the dead Poppaea, particularly around the eyes and delicate bone structure that had made her famous for her beauty. In a world where Romans believed physical similarity indicated deeper spiritual connections, this resemblance would have seemed almost supernatural to Nero's grief-addled mind. The first time Nero encountered Sporus after Poppaea's death, something clicked in the emperor's broken psyche. Here was an opportunity to undo the irreversible, to bring back what his violence had destroyed. The resemblance was so striking that Nero may have actually convinced himself he was seeing Poppaea's spirit returned in a new form, offering him a chance at redemption. Of course, there was one obvious obstacle to this fantasy. Sporus was male, but for a man who had spent months talking to a corpse, who believed himself divine, and who commanded the resources of the greatest empire on earth, changing someone's gender seemed like a minor technical problem rather than an insurmountable barrier. What happened next represents one of the most calculated acts of cruelty in human history. Nero didn't simply decide to dress Sporus as a woman for occasional entertainment or ceremonial purposes. He resolved to make the transformation permanent, complete, and irreversible. The emperor summoned the most skilled physicians in Rome and ordered them to perform surgery on the young man purely to make him appear more feminine, procedures that were dangerous, excruciatingly painful, and guaranteed to change Sporus forever. This wasn't mere mutilation or arbitrary cruelty. It was the systematic destruction of Sporus's identity as a human being, reducing him to raw material that could be reshaped to serve Nero's psychological needs. The surgical procedures were primitive by modern standards, relying on basic instruments and crude anesthetics that provided minimal relief from agony. The process would have been excruciating, lasting hours with significant risk of death from blood loss, infection, or shock. Ancient surgical techniques involved heated metal instruments, rough sutures, and herbal compounds that offered limited pain management. Sporus would have been held down by guards while physicians approached with their tools, knowing that his screams and pleas would fall on deaf ears. The emperor who ordered his transformation would have been immune to any appeals for mercy. viewing Sporus's suffering as a necessary sacrifice to his grand vision of resurrection. The recovery period lasted weeks or months, during which Sporus's life hung in the balance while his mutilated body struggled to heal. Ancient medical knowledge was insufficient to prevent most complications, meaning that survival depended largely on luck rather than skill. Even if he lived through the immediate trauma, he would be forever changed. Physically, emotionally, and socially, he would never father children, never experience normal relationships, and never be considered fully male by Roman society. Once Sporus had survived the surgery and recovered sufficiently to stand and walk, Nero announced something that shocked even the jaded aristocrats of imperial Rome. He intended to marry the young man in a full ceremonial wedding that would be recognized as legally binding. The preparations consumed months and enormous resources, treating this bizarre union as if it were a legitimate imperial marriage worthy of Rome's greatest traditions. Sporus was given a new name, Sabina, after the dead empress, and moved to special quarters where he could be prepared for his new role. The transformation involved far more than simply putting him in women's clothing. It required the complete reconstruction of his identity, personality, and social presentation to create a convincing replacement for the woman Nero had murdered. Imperial seamstresses created an entire wardrobe designed specifically for Sporus's modified physique, crafting gowns that would flatter his altered anatomy, while concealing any remaining masculine characteristics. Master jewelers worked for months creating ornaments that would complement his features, many incorporating precious stones that had once belonged to Poppaea herself. These weren't merely accessories, they were tangible links to the dead woman, physical reminders of the person Sporus was being forced to replace. Makeup artists taught him cosmetic techniques to feminize his features, showing him how to use kohl around his eyes to make them appear larger and more feminine, how to apply rouge to create the appearance of natural blushes, and how to use powders and oils to soften facial angles that might suggest masculinity. These lessons were simply about appearance. They were exercises in the systematic erasure of his original identity. Hairdressers instructed him in the elaborate styling techniques fashionable among aristocratic Roman women, teaching him to arrange his hair in complex patterns that often incorporated expensive ornaments and required hours of daily maintenance. The process involved heated metal tools, intricate braiding, and careful positioning of decorative elements that would mark him as belonging to the highest levels of society. But perhaps most psychologically damaging were the lessons in feminine behavior and deportment that Sporus was forced to master. He was assigned tutors who taught him how to walk, sit, and gesture in ways deemed appropriately ladylike by Roman standards. He learned how to hold his hands, position his feet, arrange his clothing when seated, and move through space in ways that conveyed grace rather than masculine strength. Voice coaches worked with him to modify his speech patterns, teaching him to speak in higher tones and adopt the linguistic mannerisms associated with feminine discourse in Roman society. This was perhaps the most challenging aspect of his transformation, as vocal patterns are deeply ingrained habits that resist conscious modification. The process required constant practice and vigilant self-monitoring to prevent lapses that might expose his original identity. Can you imagine the psychological torture of this daily transformation? Every morning, Sporus was forced to look in mirrors that reflected back a stranger wearing his face. Every lesson in feminine behavior reminded him that his authentic identity was being systematically erased and replaced with an artificial construction designed to serve another person's fantasy. Every piece of jewelry that had once adorned a dead woman became a shackle binding him to a role he had never chosen. The wedding ceremony was scheduled for spring 67 AD, timed to coincide with religious festivals that would add ceremonial weight to the proceedings. Nero spared no expense, treating the event as a legitimate imperial wedding worthy of the greatest emperor in Roman history. The ceremony took place in the largest palace hall, decorated with flowers imported from across the empire and illuminated by thousands of oil lamps that created an atmosphere of otherworldly beauty. Musicians played traditional wedding songs, while servants offered the finest wines and delicacies from imperial kitchens. To observers who didn't understand the full context, it might have appeared to be a normal imperial wedding celebrating the union of emperor and empress. But those who knew the truth understood they were witnessing something unprecedented and deeply disturbing. The most powerful man in the world publicly marrying a surgically modified teenage boy who had been transformed to resemble his murdered wife. The ceremony included all traditional Roman wedding rituals: the exchange of vows, the joining of hands, the sharing of sacred bread, and the signing of legal documents that made their union official under imperial law. Wedding guests played their roles with accomplished acting skills, offering congratulations and presenting expensive gifts, while maintaining expressions of appropriate joy and celebration. But beneath the surface pageantry, the atmosphere must have been thick with barely concealed horror, fascination, and the nervous energy that comes from participating in something fundamentally wrong. Everyone present understood they were witnessing not a celebration of love, but a public display of imperial madness that had transformed human suffering into state ceremony. Following the wedding, Nero treated Sporus exactly as he would have treated a legitimate empress. The young man received his own household staff, luxurious quarters within the palace complex, and a substantial income from the imperial treasury. He was provided with his own litter for traveling through the city, horses for riding in the countryside, and a retinue of servants and supporters who catered to his every need. But all this apparent luxury came with a terrible price: the complete erasure of his original identity and the constant performance of a psychologically devastating role that required him to pretend to be a dead woman. Sporus was expected to accompany Nero to public functions, sit beside him at state dinners, and play the devoted wife in all social interactions. This wasn't simply about maintaining appearances. Nero genuinely seemed to believe he had successfully resurrected Poppaea through his surgical and social transformation of Sporus. The emperor would call Sporus by his dead wife's name, reminisce about shared memories that had never actually occurred, and expect responses that maintained the elaborate fiction of resurrection. For Sporus, every day became a high-stakes performance where the slightest mistake in character could result in punishment or death. He had to remember not just how to look and act like a woman, but how to respond as if he were actually Poppaea herself, possessing her memories and experiences. When Nero mentioned events from his previous marriage, Sporus had to react as if he remembered them personally rather than as stories he had been told. When the emperor expressed grief about Poppaea's death, Sporus had to comfort him while simultaneously maintaining the fiction that he was the woman being mourned. The psychological complexity of this performance was almost impossible to sustain, requiring constant vigilance and perfect emotional control. Ancient sources describe Sporus as becoming increasingly skilled at this deception over time, developing an almost supernatural ability to anticipate Nero's moods and respond appropriately to his emotional needs. But they also note that he grew more withdrawn and melancholic as the months passed, though he continued to play his assigned role perfectly in public settings. The psychological strain of this existence is almost impossible for modern minds to comprehend. Every morning, Sporus woke in rooms decorated to remind him of a dead woman he had never met. Every reflection in polished metal showed him a face that bore no resemblance to his original appearance. Every conversation required him to pretend to be someone else entirely, drawing upon memories and experiences that belonged to another person. For over 2 years, Sporus lived this nightmarish existence, but his ordeal reached new heights of absurdity. When Nero decided to embark on an artistic tour of Greece, the emperor fancied himself a talented performer and was eager to compete in Greek festivals where he believed his artistic abilities would receive proper appreciation from audiences who understood culture better than his Roman subjects. Naturally, Sporus accompanied him on this journey, displayed to foreign dignitaries as the Empress of Rome. Imagine Greek aristocrats trying to make sense of their Roman conqueror traveling with a teenage boy dressed as a woman, demanding that everyone treat this obvious fiction as diplomatic reality. The cognitive dissonance must have been overwhelming for foreign officials. who had to maintain polite facades while processing the evidence of imperial madness standing directly in front of them. But by 68 AD, Nero's excesses had finally pushed the Roman establishment beyond their tolerance limits. Military rebellions erupted across the empire, led by provincial governors who had grown tired of the emperor's erratic behavior and complete neglect of governmental responsibilities. The Praetorian Guard, the elite military unit responsible for protecting the emperor, declared their opposition to Nero's continued rule. The Roman Senate passed a resolution condemning him as an enemy of the state and authorizing his removal from power. When Nero finally fled Rome with a small group of loyal supporters, Sporus was among them. Even facing death and the collapse of his empire, the emperor couldn't bear to leave behind his living reminder of Poppaea. They took refuge in a villa outside the city, waiting for either rescue by remaining supporters or capture by their enemies. While Nero alternated between grandiose escape plans and theatrical preparations for suicide, when word arrived that enemy forces were closing in and capture was inevitable, Nero finally chose death over the humiliation of being paraded through Rome as a defeated prisoner. His suicide left Sporus in an incredibly vulnerable position as one of the most visible symbols of the fallen emperor's reign. He represented both a valuable prize for those seeking to demonstrate their victory over Nero's legacy and a dangerous liability who knew too many imperial secrets. What followed Nero's death was perhaps even more tragic than what had come before. Sporus became a political pawn, passed from one powerful man to another like a piece of valuable property with no agency over his own fate. He was first claimed by Nymphidius Sabinus, then by Emperor Otho, and finally by with each new owner treating him much as Nero had, keeping him dressed as a woman and calling him by Poppaea's name. It was under Vitellius that Sporus's nightmare reached its ultimate and most degrading conclusion. The new emperor decided to use him for public entertainment in the Colosseum, specifically in theatrical reenactments of mythological scenes that typically involved violence, sexual humiliation, and death. For Sporus, this represented the final degradation, being reduced to a sexual spectacle for the amusement of thousands of Roman citizens who would cheer his suffering. Rather than submit to this ultimate humiliation, Sporus made the only choice that had been truly his own in years. He took his own life, probably by poison, sometime in 69 AD. He was no more than 20 years old. In death, Sporus finally escaped the grotesque theater that had consumed his adult life, choosing to end his suffering rather than endure further degradation for the entertainment of others. His suicide became both a tragedy and a final act of defiance, a refusal to be degraded further, even at the cost of his life. The fact that he chose death over continued abuse suggests that somewhere beneath the layers of forced femininity and imperial conditioning, some spark of his original self had survived. His final decision represented the reclamation of the one thing that had been denied him throughout his adult life: the power to make his own choices about his fate. Perhaps most tragically, we know almost nothing about who Sporus was before his transformation began. What were his hopes and dreams as a teenage freedman in the imperial household? What did he want to do with his life? What kind of person was he before Nero decided his face resembled a dead woman? All of that authentic identity was erased when he became the emperor's living doll, replaced by a performance so complete that his original personality disappeared entirely. The boy who was forced to become an empress, who endured years of psychological and physical abuse, who finally chose death over further degradation, deserves to be remembered not just as a curiosity from ancient Rome, but as a testament to both human cruelty and human resilience. His story reminds us that behind every narrative of imperial grandeur and historical spectacle, there are individual human experiences of suffering and survival that demand our attention and compassion, even across the vast gulf of 2,000 years. In choosing his own death, Sporus reclaimed the agency that had been systematically stripped away from him. His story challenges us to recognize the individual humanity that exists behind historical accounts of political power and imperial excess, and to understand that the cost of absolute authority is often paid not by those who wield it, but by those who are unfortunate enough to become the objects of their obsessions. If this story of transformation, abuse, and ultimate resistance has affected you, I want to hear your thoughts in the comments. What aspect of Sporus' ordeal do you find most disturbing? The surgical transformation that destroyed his body, the psychological conditioning that erased his identity, or the way he was passed between emperors like property after Nero's death? And if you're re-interested in more stories that reveal the human cost of historical events that we often romanticize, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. History is filled with individual tragedies that deserve our attention, not just as lessons about the past, but as reminders of our responsibility to protect the vulnerable from those who would exploit them for their own purposes.